can? Okay. Whenever you are done, let us know.
I don't think so, no.
I think it was all together. The weekend. Yeah.
Dacă nu auzea nimeni,
Dacă nu nicio problemă, pun și asta e.
tu nu mă auzi acum?
Nicio problemă, pun acolo și fac traducerea.
Mă auziți? Noastră mă auziți?
Da, eu da.
Deci doar doamna nu mă aude.
Casca aia.
Okay. No problem. Okay. 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 Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. We are the members of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. We are here on official visit upon the invitation of the government of Romania to have this mission on issues of women and girls. At the end of our 12 days mission, we are sharing our preliminary findings from the mission. The delegation of the mission included myself, Ms. Karam Gesset, the chair of the UN Working Group, and also the expert member of the group, my colleague Ivana Radacic. Our mission included visits to different government and non-government institutions in Bucharest, Mizil, Valea Seca, Slobozia Bradulu, Cluj-Napoca, and Sibiu. We have had fruitful discussions with representatives from government institutions, from schools, hospitals, also representatives from UN institutions, from civil society organizations, academia, and also women and girls from different communities. We are here now to share our preliminary findings of this visit. I just want to end by saying, before I leave the floor to my colleague Ivana, who will take us through these preliminary findings from this mission, which will be followed by a full report at a later stage, I would like to make the remark that the working group is part of the UN Human Rights Council Special Procedures or UN Human Rights Council women's rights mechanisms, and it is composed of 5 members, which includes the 2 of us and our colleagues from the other parts of the world, from the Latin America, from Asia, and from the Western European and other groups. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to my colleague.
Thank you for coming. So my name is Ivana Radacic, and I am from this region as well. We wanted to note first that the government has developed, or that Romania has a good legal policy and institutional framework, and that the government is taking a number of measures to ensure rights of women. However, there are challenges in implementation of the frameworks due to political, socioeconomic, and cultural factors. And in terms of the political factors, the frequent changes of government hamper, for sure, the implementation of the laws and policies. On a socioeconomic level, Romania is one of the poorest countries in the EU, which also has implications for securing rights of women and girls, particularly in the rural areas. And also in terms of the cultural norms, as in many countries, women are still seen as primarily having a role in taking care of the children and in the household, and there is a problem, of course, as in other places, of gender stereotypes, here also compounded by racial prejudice and other type of norms. So in terms of the social and economic rights, we noted that there is still an issue of securing adequate standard of living for all women and girls, particularly again in rural communities, affecting primarily Roma households. We noted the measures that the government is taking, but we think that they need to be more specific and targeted specifically for the most vulnerable groups of women and girls, housing shame, for example, and other type of social benefits. In terms of the employment, we know that the gap is not as high as in some countries. Currently, actually, unemployment rate is lower for women than for men. Also, the gender pay gap is lower than average in Europe. But there are still issues of securing access to decent jobs for women and girls. And there is a problem of discrimination in the workplace, including sexual harassment. And it all stems also from the women's disproportionate take of the roles in caring for children and other relatives, and we think that sufficient services for childcare, for care of elderly, etc., would be needed to improve also the possibility of women to ensure work-life balance. In terms of the healthcare services, we know that Romania has a comprehensive universal health coverage, but that there is an issue of access to health, particularly again for women coming from more poor areas and again disproportionately affecting Roma women and girls. One of the big problems that we have heard throughout the country visit were informal payments, but also other issues such as even the quality of healthcare services in more poor areas was noted. Moreover, we have heard we note the problems even in terms of the securing rights in childbirth, high rate of C-sections, and maybe lack of protocols to regulate that human rights at birth are secured. Also that there is insufficient number of family planning services, that can be a challenge for women and girls, including in some communities. The challenge can even be accessing hygienic menstrual products, hygienic products for menstruation. So we call really on the government to secure all the range of family planning services and also access to legal abortion. In terms of education, we were primarily concerned with the early dropout rate due primarily to the early marriages in certain, again, areas. And we think that sexuality education would really help in addressing this problem. And apparently it's not still a compulsory subject, and it doesn't reach all the women and girls. And also the more efforts in securing human rights topics such as gender-based violence and equality against women and not against, equality of women and girls should be really integrated in all the curricula. But in terms also that we feel that Romania should take more efforts to challenge the gender stereotypes, which are also seen in the prosecution, for example, of cases of gender-based violence, where certain cases were noted but also were discussed by the European Court of Human Rights, where even a sexual intercourse with minor girls of 11 years old get treated as consensual sexual intercourse. Or also with women and girls with disabilities when they are sexually assaulted. Sometimes it's also treated as a consensual sex. So that again, the problem of forced early marriage, there is gaps in prosecution of the phenomenon, and we call for the efforts to address this and also generally to de-ethnicize the problem of violence against women, which sometimes happens with the way violence against Roma women and girls is treated. In terms of the trafficking, which is a big problem here in terms of the number of victims, survivors, The government has been taking many efforts, but we still note some challenges in terms of maybe still need for the training of the officials, also securing accountability for when the officials are involved, securing that girls who are in protection of the state, who are living in institutions, are protected, not further exploited, and that all the necessary services are really put in place. There are many envisaged by law, but the challenge now remains to really secure the implementation. And as a conclusion, we would like to stress that we really noted the important work that the civil society is doing, often providing the services really to the victims, survivors of gender-based violence and many other efforts. And we have noted firsthand the impact this has, particularly in closed-off communities. And we really call on the government to ensure that their expertise is taken into account, and that women and girls of different communities are included in decision-making and monitoring of the policy, design and implementation and monitoring of the policies. So I think this is as a way of introduction, and now, of course, we are open to questions.
Thank you very much. And these are our preliminary findings. As we said, it will be followed by a further elaborated report. And we would like to reiterate our thanks to the government of Romania for inviting us and having this cooperation. And also we would like to thank all the interlocutors for the fruitful discussion and information that they have provided. With this note, we are now opening the floor for any questions and comments.
Have you had similar missions in other countries in the region, and how does Romania compare to other countries?
You can take this.
Yeah, we have had, this is the fourth visit in the so-called Eastern European countries. Not all were conducted by the current working group, because we are the second group of persons. And I think it's a difficult question to compare countries, and often it's also a sensitive issue, and often countries feel called out. What I can say is that every country we have visited in Eastern, Western, in any other part of the world has issues. I think here what are the challenges are these, what I said. There is an issue of political constant changes of the government. I think the socioeconomic position of Romania, like poverty, is something that then relates to certain specific issues which you might not see maybe as much in some other places we visited. And I think these are maybe the main distinctive factors that then relate to certain specific problems. So some of the problems that are specific, and it's not only our findings, is this problem of early marriages. Not that they don't exist in other Eastern European countries, but the number here is higher. And the trafficking, I think, and also, again, it's really the highest number of victims, or the very high number of victims are Romanian, especially young girls, which again relates also to poverty, to the problem of care of children in state protection, which again also has a historical reason. So I think these are maybe some of the specificities here.
And if I may add on that, in terms of the region, also we show political and public participation is also an area where there are low representation of women in the parliament, for example, from the EU regional figures. That's one thing. But on the contrary, also we saw also a good number of representation of women in the judiciary and in the prosecution. In terms of employment, the low gender gap, that Romania has the lowest gender pay gap, is it's a very encouraging also progress that we have noted.
And maybe one additional thing is, which we have heard quite a lot, it's really access to healthcare due to even though it's supposed to be free, we heard that in practice there is many barriers to accessing it, including informal payments. But then I also want to maybe add, coming from this region as well, that on the other hand, with the Istanbul Convention, I think that Romania has progressed well in terms of implementation in the sense of the legal framework. The introduction of temporary protection orders is, I think, something that is really a promising practice.
When you say that the highest number of victims of trafficking are Romanians, do you mean in the region or among the 4 countries that the UN has visited, or
In the EU, yes, it's from the report. So it's the highest number of victims of trafficking and traffickers in the EU.
Is the report going to be published?
This is not our report. This is a report we consulted, and it's the Salvation Army and Freedom House report from 2018, also the US Embassy's figures. So, because we consult really also the other available documents that are here. And indeed, we went to some shelters. This was also, we went to shelters for the victims of survivors of domestic violence and of trafficking. And we have really heard some very disturbing stories.
So you think poverty is among the main causes?
One, and the other thing I suppose I supposed to mention, which is a specifically from what we noted in Romania, is like the high number of immigration, no? Which then leaves many children in general without 1 or 2 parents, which of course then leads to increased vulnerability. And also, the question of the care of children generally, which is again not something that we have necessarily noted in the 12-day visit, but it has been reported that many girls go for the lover boys because of the lack of really affection that they have been experiencing in their lives.
What was the response, for instance, when you spoke about sexual education, what was the response of the authorities? Do they plan to make this compulsory, or at least to start, because there's a big issue in Romania?
Well, we heard, I think what was encouraging is that even the state interlocutors, some of them really noted that this should be encouraged. And as far as we understood, the problem is that there is also opposition from parents and certain religious, which is again the case now in Eastern Europe, I think a big one, not only in Eastern Europe. I think what is positive is that we didn't, like that even the state authorities noted that this is something that would be useful, especially in the context of teenage pregnancies, etc. But we didn't hear specific plans how to do it. But in some areas we visited, local authorities or local schools were cooperating with NGOs on the subject. And also some of the NGOs were really going into communities and talking with the girls, which I felt was very promising. I mean, we could have seen what it means to the girls, and actually our girls interlocutors said, like we wish we hear these things in the school, and not only about sexuality. We want to learn about the values of women, for example, which was, I think, a quote we like to quote.
I would be curious about the disparity in terms of, seriousness of problems in rural and urban areas. How do they match up? Because my feeling is that there are different classes of issues.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, actually, throughout the report, that's something that is reflected in many of the areas, be it employment, access to decent job, be it education, quality of education, access and quality, also health services, the access as well as the quality, housing, for example, and other social goods and services. We really noted a big urban-rural divide, and that translates to many of the issues that women and girls face. Actually, we even put it as a context. When we assess countries, of course, we try to understand the context, and that's one of the main notable contexts that we can say about Romania, which affects almost everything. I mean, we have, of course, tried to show in most of rural areas, and also not just rural, not all rural communities, generally rural communities, but rural communities such as predominantly Roma communities, Roma women and girls, they face access. They face barriers to access to education, health services, and also Roma women access to decent jobs. That is a problem that we have noted.
There's also the feeling that civil society groups and NGOs are kind of taking over. They're shouldering the burden that officials really aren't, and I'm wondering if this doesn't sort of encourage the authorities not to take up their responsibilities. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we have noted definitely that NGOs are doing a lot, yeah, and really addressing some of the gaps that remain. I think like one concern was with some of the NGOs interlocutors that when government is doing things, and they are trying as well, that sometimes they are not taking sufficient account of what is already existing in terms of the NGOs run shelters or whatever, which need help in infrastructure, etc. So we really recommend that the way forward is the collaboration. For sure, the government has to take on the task, but there is already really a great expertise and gender sensitivity, which you see in the NGOs working directly with the communities. And also, if it's some specific issues, I think you really need to come from the ground initiatives. And in some municipalities, I think there is a better cooperation. In some, there is a lack. So, so that there is, I think, room for improvement in terms of the collaboration and the funding of the NGOs, of the civil society.
Besides this gap about access of girls in rural and urban area in education, did you find something else in education?
In education?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's generally, of course, everything is really, not everything, but most of the findings are related to the urban-rural divide. But generally, for example, I want to start from maybe good things that are there to close this gap. For example, having special measures such as student seats for disadvantaged communities. That's one of the steps that could be helpful, and that's already being taken. And we acknowledge it as a positive step. Of course, there is a long way to go to close the gap. But another issue is, like, again, it's related to the urban-rural divide, but prohibitive costs in schools that we are alerted by our interlocutors, such as informal classroom funds, for example, transport fee, accommodation or dorm costs. Those are, even though in principle education is free, those are really barriers to access to education for girls from disadvantaged family or poor families, and targeted measures are really called upon on this one. And generally also the quality of education, not the access, the quality of education is an issue that we have noted. And again, this is related to the quality of services in general in rural areas. And in certain parts of the rural areas where you have predominantly Roma communities. Sexual education is also the lack of, I mean, it was already said, but that's a gap which relates to all the other sexual and reproductive health, also the issues of gender-based violence that already highlighted. So these are issues like we identified, access issues and also quality of issues and safe school environment in general. Related to human rights education, civic education and sexual education means also having a a violence-free school environment, harassment-free school environment, a gender-sensitive school environment. All that is related to this type of the content of the education as well. Anything else, maybe?
And feel free to speak in Romanian as well.
Sigur, dacă doriți să adresați întrebările în română, ele pot fi traduse în
So if not, we can conclude, no? Maybe before we conclude, if you want to say a concluding remark, before if anything you want to emphasize. Nothing, don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I want to maybe say as the last remark. So we definitely see the efforts, and we see a vibrant movement, civil society movement, and we were also happy to know that girls are really speaking a lot. And we know that the difficulty of the context, as we say, but I think there are measures now there. There is expertise also in the civil society, so it's really now a matter of like progressing further. And maybe one of the obstacles maybe that I would like to mention is maybe limited understanding still of substantive equality. So like it's clear that it's that you cannot intentionally discriminate and or prohibit women from doing things. But when it comes to but women, especially women of particular groups, have specific needs because they were disadvantaged. They have been disadvantaged. Then maybe it's not always clear that the targeted measures are really needed to achieve substantive equality. It's not only prohibition of different treatment.
Yes, also, no, thank you. And as a concluding remark, yes, we note the existence of solid legal framework, a policy framework, and institutional framework. We're not saying that's sufficient, but there is a good framework, but we note implementation, efficiency, and independence of institutions should be an area of attention in terms of also resourcing these institutions to be efficient, respecting their independence so that they can deliver on their mandates, and also detailed policy, legal and other frameworks to really bring the laws, to take the laws into the ground, and also to have a gender perspective in the implementation of these laws, which relates to what my colleague said. Gender perspective should be part of, a central part in addressing discrimination against women and girls. But generally we note all the efforts, but the efforts would need this additional action from government in order to ensure an equal, just society for women and girls in Romania.
And if I just also may add, the clear indicators, budgeting, gender-sensitive budgeting, and data collection also. And this access to justice, which I don't think is definitely not a specificity of Romania, but like gender stereotypes in us accessing justice, I think it's also understanding the barriers of access to justice.
Thank you very much. Once again, we thank you for coming and having this interaction. And of course, our appreciation to the government for having this cooperation and all the interlocutors who are really a good source of this information. And our information does not come only from one source. We try to take different views into account, and this is our preliminary finding. This is only preliminary. We will go back, reflect, look at further information that would be coming, and prepare our report. And for your information, we have also shared this preliminary finding to government institutions earlier. Before we make it public to you, we have that discussion with government representatives, and we are aware of their perspectives on these preliminary findings. We thank you very much and wish you a good day. This one.